I had no idea what was going to happen when I moved to Memphis, Tennessee. I thought I was just moving away from my old life to start a new one. Little did I know, I would soon experience a terrifying glimpse into my own mind. It was a warm day in June when I arrived at my new apartment. I'd found it through a Craigslist ad, a quaint one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It had an old-fashioned charm, with large windows, creaky floors, and an old-fashioned sink in the kitchen. The first few days were blissful. The apartment was cozy, and I settled into a routine of reading books, listening to music, and watching movies. But soon, something strange started to happen. At first, it was just noises. I started to hear footsteps outside my bedroom window and the occasional creaking of what sounded like a door being opened. I thought it was just the neighborhood kids playing, but soon I realized that the footsteps were too heavy and deliberate to belong to children. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched became more and more intense. No matter what I did, I felt eyes on me, and it was starting to scare me. One night, I woke up to a loud banging on my door. I thought it was a prank, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. I shuddered and went back to bed, but the banging persisted. The next morning, I woke up to find my living room window broken. I felt violated and scared. Who would do this, I thought. I was sure I hadn't done anything to deserve it. I called the police, but they told me there was nothing they could do unless I had tangible evidence of the intruder. I felt helpless and frustrated. I started to look for clues around my apartment, but I found nothing. I began to worry that maybe I was going crazy, that I was imagining things. But then, one night I heard a whisper from outside my window. "Lily," it said. I froze in terror. I knew that voice. It was the same voice I'd heard when I was younger, when I was alone in the dark. My stalker had found me. I immediately called the police, but once again they told me there was nothing they could do. I was alone. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed security cameras around my apartment and bought a baseball bat for protection. I also looked into getting a guard dog, but the cost was too high. I tried to lead a normal life, but the fear of being watched never left me. I hardly slept at night, and when I did, I was plagued by nightmares. Every shadow and creak of a floorboard made me jump. I started to do whatever I could to keep the stalker away. I would stay out late and take different routes home. I even took up martial arts to give myself a fighting chance if the stalker ever came for me. But no matter what I did, I never felt safe. I was always looking over my shoulder, my nerves on edge. The stalker seemed to be everywhere. Every time I thought I had outsmarted him, he would show up again. I eventually moved out of the apartment, hoping to start fresh and forget about the stalker. But I'd only been in my new place for a week when I started to feel that same feeling of being watched once again. I knew the stalker had found me again. It's been years since then, and still I have no idea who my stalker was or why he was so obsessed with me. I still have nightmares, and I still hear that same voice in the shadows, whispering my name. I've been left with a frightening glimpse into my own mind. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, never feeling safe and secure. I'm still never sure if the stalker is still out there, waiting for me. The darkness seemed to be swallowing the moonlight as I lay in bed, the tapping against my window growing more and more intense with each passing second. Something was out there. I could feel it. I slowly crept out of bed, my feet bare on the cold floor. I made my way to the window, my heart beating faster with every step. The moonlight revealed an empty street with no trace of the tapping. I let out a sigh of relief, but the unease in my stomach remained. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing. I stepped back and turned towards my bed, but something caught my eye. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving, a dark figure gliding silently across the street. I held my breath, my heart beating faster. What was that? It was like a shadow, but not quite. I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I watched for a few moments, and then it disappeared. For the next few days, I could almost feel something watching me, following me. Every time I stepped out of my apartment, I felt as though I was being observed. Every time I turned a corner, I felt as though I was being stalked by something unseen. Each night, I heard the tapping at my window again. I never saw anything, but the feeling was unmistakable. I felt like I was being hunted, like something was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to keep my mind occupied, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt as though something was following me, a dark presence that seemed to lurk in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront my pursuer. I waited until late at night, and then I stepped out into the street. I could feel it in the air, the presence of something dark and sinister. I looked up and down the street, but I couldn't see anyone. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was the sound of footsteps, coming from somewhere close. I spun around, scanning the street, but there was no one in sight. I felt a chill, and then I heard it again, the tapping sound I had heard at my window. I shivered and looked up. A shadow figure was standing in the middle of the street, looking right at me. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. I stared at the figure, unable to speak or move a muscle. It seemed to be studying me, its eyes seeming to pierce right through me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The figure stayed there, watching me, for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I just stood there, unable to move. Finally, the figure turned around and began to seemingly float away. I watched it, my entire body shaking. I wanted to call out, to ask what it was and why it was following me, but I couldn't find my voice. It disappeared around the corner, and I felt my grip on reality slipping away. I stumbled back to my apartment, not knowing what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt a presence lingering in the shadows, following me. I still heard the tapping at my window each night, but I had no idea if it was the same figure or something else. I was at a loss for what to do, so I decided to speak to someone who might have some answers. I reached out to an old friend who lived nearby and asked her if she had ever experienced anything like this before. She told me stories about strange figures that seemed to follow people as if they were hunting them. The stories terrified me even more than before. Something dark and sinister was out there, and it was stalking me. I had no idea what its motives were or how to stop it. All I knew was that it seemed determined to follow me wherever I went. My friend suggested that I set up traps around my apartment, hoping to catch whatever was lurking outside my window. So I did. I placed tripwires around the perimeter of my house and rigged alarm bells in case anything tried to break in during the night. That night, as soon as darkness fell, I heard the tapping again at my window. But this time it was different. It felt almost like an invitation. Like whatever it was wanted me to come outside and meet it face to face. A chill ran down my spine as fear crept into my mind. But fear or not, something told me that if I wanted answers, this might be my only chance to get them. So with a deep breath and trembling hands, I opened my window and stepped out into the night air. The street below seemed empty, too empty for comfort. But then suddenly there it was, a shadow figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. It didn't move or speak. It just watched me from beneath its hooded cloak with piercing eyes that seemed to stare into my very soul. I gulped and took a few steps closer, hoping to get a better look. But the figure suddenly rushed towards me with an eerie, almost supernatural speed. I screamed and jumped back as it disappeared into the shadows, leaving me gasping for breath in its wake. The figure never returned, and I was left with no answers. Just the endless tapping at my window each night to remind me of what had happened. Despite my fear, though, I can't help but feel a strange sense of wonder every time I hear that tapping noise. It's like something mysterious and magical is luring me further and further down an unknown path, though where it might lead me is anyone's guess. I have to warn others about my mailman, about the dark figure that lurks in the shadows of my thoughts night and day. I can no longer ignore the feeling that there is something sinister about him, something that brings a chill to my bones. I wish I could turn away and forget this ever happened, but it is impossible to escape the paranoia and fear that has crept into my soul. It began a few weeks ago when I awoke earlier than usual one morning. I found myself lying in bed, unable to move and filled with a deep sense of dread. Something felt wrong, as if something was watching me as I slept. I shook off the fear and moved to get out of bed. But as I opened my eyes, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, but by the time I reached the door, the figure had vanished. I searched and searched, but could not find any trace of it. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to put it out of my mind, but something still nagged at me. As the days passed, the feeling only grew stronger. I started to be aware of a presence in my home, watching me when I least expected it. I would catch glimpses of him in the shadows, but he was always gone before I could get a good look. My mailman, I was sure, was the one behind it all. I shook off the thought, telling myself it was impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more convincing it seemed. He was always lurking around my house, dropping off packages and letters late into the evening, long after my mailbox should have been empty. One day I opened my door to find him standing on my porch, his eyes cold and penetrating. He smiled at me, a malicious grin that sent chills down my spine. I quickly shut the door and locked it before he could say anything. I noticed that he seemed to always be watching me, no matter where I went. I would catch him out of the corner of my eye, always standing just out of sight. I started to be aware of a presence in my home, watching me when I least expected it. The feeling of dread was so strong that I stopped going out of my house and began to avoid him at all costs. But it wasn't enough. He still found ways to get closer to me, showing up at my door with packages and letters, always smiling that same sinister smile. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, and the fear slowly began to take over my life. One night I awoke to find him standing outside my bedroom window, watching me as I slept. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, but he was gone before I could reach the window. That was the final straw. I finally had enough and called the postal service to see about reporting him or at least getting a new mail person. I expected them to be accommodating, but instead I was met with disbelief and suspicion. They asked me questions, trying to poke holes in my story as if they were trying to protect him. I hung up feeling frustrated and helpless. I wanted nothing more than for this nightmare to end, but it seemed like there was nothing I could do. But then something changed. A few days later, there was a different mailman delivering my packages, and he greeted me with a friendly smile instead of menace. I was elated, thinking that this nightmare was finally over. But when I asked the new mailman about his predecessor, he could only tell me that he had been reassigned to a different route without any further explanation. I still don't know what happened to that mailman. He just seemed to vanish overnight, as if he had never been there in the first place. I can only hope that wherever he is, he won't be able to torment anyone else like he did me. I felt the chill before I saw it. It was like a cold hand on the back of my neck, a prickling sensation that made my skin crawl. I glanced around, expecting to see some unseen presence, but there was nothing. Just the other pedestrians going about their daily lives, oblivious to my growing fear. But I knew. I could feel it in my bones, a presence that was always there, creeping into my life, a shadow in the black of night. I had been aware of it for weeks now. At first it was just an occasional glimpse in the corner of my eye, a flickering shadow or a whisper of movement. Gradually, I had become aware of a presence, a figure that was always there, silent and unspoken. It followed me everywhere I went, and yet it never spoke. I began to think of it as a demon, even though it had no physical form. It first appeared at work. I would catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye as I was walking down the hall or taking a break in the lounge. I became paranoid, convinced that I was being watched. I would constantly look over my shoulder, searching for its presence, but it would always be gone. The same thing happened on the subway. I would feel its presence, a chill in the air that seemed to come from nowhere. I would scan the crowds, looking for a sign of it, but there would never be anything. I began to worry that I was losing my mind, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then it appeared at the gym. I had just finished my workout and was heading to the locker room when I saw it. It was far away, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me as I walked. It was like a dark specter, a presence that I couldn't shake, I hurried through the locker room and rushed to the safety of my apartment building. As I entered, I could feel its cold gaze still on me. I looked around, but there was nothing. I knew, however, that it was still there, just out of sight. I made it to my apartment and slammed the door behind me. I leaned against the door and took a deep breath. I felt like I had been running for my life, and yet I was still being followed. I felt like I was being hunted. I stayed inside for days, fearful to leave the apartment. I was afraid of what I might find outside. I watched out the window, always looking for the dark figure that seemed to haunt me. I was so scared that I barely slept. Finally, my fear got the best of me, and I decided to take a walk. I needed to get away from my apartment and out into the fresh air. I hoped to lose the presence that had been stalking me. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. I started to walk slowly at first, looking around warily for any sign of the demon. As I walked through the streets, I noticed something odd. Everywhere I looked, there were people jogging, pushing strollers, walking their dogs, all seemingly normal activities for a warm summer day in the park. But then, a strange realization hit me. Some of these people never seemed to notice my presence at all. Not even when I waved or nodded in their direction. It was almost like I was invisible. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that was growing within me. But the more I walked, the more I noticed the strange behavior of the people around me. Some were walking into trees, others were walking into each other, and yet no one seemed to notice. As I walked, I realized that I was no longer in my own neighborhood. The buildings were unfamiliar, the roads strange. I had no idea how I had ended up here. I started to feel like I was in a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't escape. That's when I saw it. The demon that had been haunting me for weeks. It was standing across the street, watching me with its glowing eyes. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its limbs were long and spindly like tree branches. It was covered in shadows, and I could barely make out its features, but I knew it was looking right at me. I gasped and started to back away, but it was too late. The demon was already crossing the street, its footsteps silent on the pavement. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran as fast as I could, but I could feel the demon's presence getting closer and closer. I quickly rounded the corner, and my heart sank when I realized that I had somehow managed to make a complete circle, coming right back to where I started my walk. And suddenly there was no sign of the demon anywhere. I stayed inside for the next few weeks, my fear mounting each night. I was convinced that the figure was following me, stalking me through the darkness. I felt like I was being watched, like it was always one step behind me. One night, I woke up to find the demon standing at the foot of my bed. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, illuminating my room in an eerie green light. It reached out with its spindly fingers and touched me, its cold touch sending shivers down my spine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The demon leaned in closer, its shadowy face inches away from mine. I could feel its breath on my skin, a cold, putrid smell that made me want to vomit. And then, suddenly, it was gone. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. But it was no use. I stayed up until daylight, still unable to breathe normally. The fear and terror of the night before had taken hold, making it almost impossible for me to relax or even think clearly. I stumbled around my room, desperate for some sort of distraction, but nothing seemed to work. Eventually, exhaustion set in, and I found myself barely able to keep my eyes open. At some point after day broke, I passed out and slept for almost 24 hours. When I woke up, the fear was still there, but it felt different now, like a distant memory that was quickly fading away. It's been weeks since I last saw it, but I still feel it lurking in the shadows. I can still feel its presence, and I can still feel its eyes on me. It's like I can sense it in the air, a presence that just won't go away. So now I live in fear, never sure if the figure will appear again or if I'll ever be safe again. I do my best to go about my life as if nothing had changed, but deep down I know that something has. I don't know what it is or why it's here, but I do know one thing. I'm not safe. The moment I met May, I knew something was off. It was at a small coffee shop on the corner of my street. I was running late and almost hadn't made it in time, but I managed to squeeze myself between two people and grab a seat. When I looked up from my phone, there she was. May was unlike anyone I had ever met before. She was wearing a bright yellow dress that seemed to make her glow against the drab surroundings of the coffee shop. She had a sparkle in her eyes that I had never seen before, and I was immediately drawn to her. We started talking, and soon enough I had completely forgotten about the time. We talked about our favorite books, places we had traveled, and dreams we had for the future. I could tell she was something special, and the way I felt when I was around her was unlike anything I had felt before. But then something strange happened. I noticed that I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I looked around, I was certain that someone was staring at me. I could feel the intensity of their gaze, as if they were trying to get inside my head and figure out why I had been talking to May for so long. I finally got the courage to ask May if she was seeing someone, and she nervously told me that she had recently broken up with someone named Tristan. He was apparently very possessive and jealous, and wouldn't take no for an answer. At that moment, I knew why I had been feeling like I was being watched. I asked May if Tristan had ever done anything to scare her, and she told me that he had been following her and sending her strange messages. She said she had been trying to avoid him, but it was getting harder and harder. I told her that if she ever needed help, I was there for her, and I meant it. The next few weeks were filled with tension. I was constantly on the lookout for Tristan wherever I went. I had a feeling that he was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I started to take extra precautions, like staying inside at night and avoiding places that I knew he frequented. I tried my best to protect May, but I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it forever. And then one day it all came to a head. I had just gotten home from work and was about to let my dog out when I noticed something strange. There was a man lurking in the shadows of my backyard. He was tall and had a jagged scar running down his face. I immediately knew it was Tristan. My dog Max had already started barking, and before I knew it, he was running towards Tristan. As he did, Tristan pulled out a gun and pointed it at him. I rushed inside to warn May, but when we came out, both Tristan and Max were gone. He had taken Max hostage, and I was filled with dread as I realized he would use him to get back at me. Sure enough, the following days were filled with threatening notes left on my doorstep and calls from unknown numbers. He even managed to find my number somehow and sent me multiple texts taunting me about my relationship with May. Every time I heard his voice or read one of his messages, I felt a chill run down my spine. For weeks, this continued until finally the police managed to apprehend him after receiving numerous reports from locals about suspicious activity in the area. When they arrested him, they found Max tied up in the trunk of his car. My poor pup was terrified, but thankfully unharmed. I thanked the police for their help and brought Max home safe and sound, where we could finally get some peace of mind again. As of writing this, May and I are still together, and we're happy and expecting a little one soon. As for Tristan, he's still locked up, and we hope it will stay that way for a very, very long time. Thank you all for joining me for these deeply unsettling tales tonight on Stories by Banick. I truly appreciate your support. If you were left looking over your shoulder, be sure to hit that like button. Got a true stalker story or any eerie experience of your own? Share it with us in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing for more hair-raising stories. Remember, in the vast realm of the unknown, you're never truly alone. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.